So let's dive into some of the conclusions. On the left here are the different pieces of data that we use to triangulate. So there have been two recent FOIA requests that have been provided, the one from Wolfstorf and from Meyer Law Group. Different types of information are consolidated here. IIUSA did a great job of gathering a lot of data from many of the major EB5 players in terms of approval timelines and trends, and we've incorporated some of that information. Additionally, the two pieces of proprietary information that have not been seen before. First is the customer's bank wire information of just how new investors wiring, which typically lags filings. So we're able to see, it's ahead of filing. So we're able to see what the future looks like in terms of filings that are going to be submitted. And then internally, we've been able to analyze all the data that we have of our well over 100 I-526E approvals, 956F, and get to these conclusions. So the first main conclusion that we've come to is that although the high unemployment urban TEAs have been much more popular, 1.5 investors for every one rural investor have chosen the high unemployment versus rural, it does seem like, based on the recent data, that it is shifting more towards rural, almost closer to a 50-50 balance. Now, it's still 2-to-1 in terms of the set-aside visas, 20% for rural versus 10% for the high unemployment. So to have a real balance, you would need to go 2-to-1 rural versus urban, and we're not seeing any indication that we're even getting close to that. But we are seeing a real shift towards more investors are now looking at rural as a viable option, and we believe that's because approval data is coming out and people are getting approved relatively quickly. The next big item that I'd say that we're seeing from these FOIA requests is that the two big markets are China and Indian-born investors. Over 70% of all post-RIA investors come from those two countries alone. So we are seeing a lot of the major players in the EB5 space focus on investors from those countries because that's the highest bang for the buck, rather than going for countries that have 5 to 10 investors when you can get well over 2/3 of the industry with two major markets. The third key point is that Chinese and Indian investors very likely already face backlogs. Mathematically, we don't see how it's possible that there are not significant backlogs in the high unemployment urban category, and we'll run through some of this data later of how we get to the point of where it's at. And then in terms of rural, there does still seem to be sufficient supply in terms of the visas that need to be issued. There still is a good runway here, but it is getting to the point that a volume keeps increasing. We could even see very short backlogs, but something show up in the rural category in the next couple of years. Next, and this is a takeaway that we have, which is a little bit different than what's been presented by some others, just because we're looking at the data internally and really taking a step back, which is USCIS is absolutely prioritizing rural 526E forms. We have both urban, high unemployment, and rural deals. And although we can look at some charts in terms of the average processing time for high unemployment deals versus rural deals, nearly all of those high unemployment approvals came from the very start of the post-RIA period when there were not rural deals available or very few. So it's a bit skewed because the vast majority of all petitions were in high unemployment, and those were the first in. So we are seeing a good number of those approved. But since after the first, let's say 9 months of that program, we're not seeing any high unemployment approvals, and we're seeing tons of rural approvals. So the key number that I would say is that of all the data, 92% of the high unemployment urban TEA 526Es are not adjudicated yet. So anything that we're looking at for average processing times of a high unemployment TEA, I would say are pretty anecdotal, seeing that over 90% of those petitions that have been filed have not actually been adjudicated. So that is one thing that I think we probably differ on than some other groups in trying to interpret the data, is that we just think that's too small of a sample size, 8% being approved, and most of those coming from the very first start of the program when there weren't rural options, we think skews that data a little bit. And the last key takeaway, and this is something also unique to us based on viewing the customer's data, which we'll get into later, is that we believe the overall demand for EB5 has stayed relatively consistent. There was the fee increase that happened earlier this year in April, which did pull a lot of filings to the point where, based on USCIS data, there was about a 90% drop off from the quarter before the fee increase to the one after. And the data from customers bank and our internal data shows that's not actually reality. Yes, filings may have crashed by 90%, but demand was much smoother than it appears in terms of new investors signing up and sending in their wires. So we'll run through some of that data too, but I think that's a very important thing is number 4 and 5 on this list are unique insights that we've come to that have not really been presented by others, but we think are very important when investors are analyzing making their EB5 investment. And I know that was a lot of information that we went through very quickly, but I wanted to highlight a lot of these key conclusions so that as we go through the rest of the presentation, you'll see the backup for this and where we're getting at. But I think that this is, at least to me, the high level information that we've been able to gather.